Welcome to another quiet journey into the past. Tonight we travel to a time long ago, to the ancient Roman Empire, where bustling streets were lined with marble columns and warm sunlight filtered through terracotta roofs. But this story isn't about emperors or wars. It's about something much smaller and slower. We're going to follow one quiet day in the life of a young workshop apprentice named Lucius, as he wakes with the Roman sun and prepares for another modest day of learning, crafting, and dreaming. Later on, we will introduce a second story about a young woman named Roma who is living in a small Tudor town. This story sets the scene: the cobblestone streets, the thatched roofs of cottages, the distant sounds of livestock, and the market square bustling with farmers and traders. The goal here is to paint a vivid yet calm picture of daily life of that era. Lucius wakes before the first golden hints of sunrise stretch across the Roman sky. The room is dark and cool, with only the faintest sound of distant footsteps echoing in the alley below. He lies still for a moment, his body pressed into the straw-filled mat that has become familiar and forgiving over time. The stone floor beneath him holds the night's chill, but it does not bother him. He rises slowly, stretching his arms toward the low wooden beams above. His tunic hangs neatly on a peg by the door, freshly laundered by his mother the day before. He pulls it over his head, smoothing the fabric with quiet care. The wool is coarse but warm. He slips on his worn leather sandals, then opens the door to the street. The city is just beginning to wake. A baker's boy rushes past with a cloth-wrapped bundle of bread. A few chickens scuttle into a courtyard nearby, pecking at yesterday's crumbs. Lucius makes his way to the well, filling a clay jug with water, careful not to spill a drop. The handle is cool in his hand. He lifts it, heavy but manageable, and heads home again. His breakfast is simple: barley bread dipped in watered-down wine, a few olives, and a small piece of goat cheese. He eats in silence, watching the sky brighten with soft shades of blue. His mother hums as she sweeps the doorway. His younger sister is still asleep, curled beneath a woolen blanket. After finishing breakfast, Lucius takes a moment to tidy the common room. He folds the spare blanket, tucks his sister's doll into its nook, and sweeps a corner of dust the breeze had stirred. He enjoys these quiet rituals, simple acts that make his small world orderly. Lucius gathers his satchel. Inside are the tools of his apprenticeship: a bronze chisel wrapped in linen, a mallet with a smooth wooden handle, a bit of charcoal for marking, and his prized possession, a small whetstone gifted to him by his master. He slings the satchel across his chest and steps into the growing light. The walk to the workshop is familiar. The narrow streets are lined with buildings made of sun-baked stone and brick. Vines creep along walls. Laundry hangs overhead. He greets the butcher, who nods from behind a row of hanging meats. He pauses briefly by a fig tree, plucking a fallen leaf and rubbing it between his fingers, inhaling its sharp green scent. Passing the baths, he hears the splash of early bathers and the low rumble of voices discussing politics and weather. The scent of warm oil and fresh herbs carries out into the street. Lucius smiles, reminded of when he accompanied his father here long ago. When he arrives, his master Marcus is already inside. The workshop smells of iron and ash. The forge glows dully in the corner, not yet stoked for the day. Marcus grunts a greeting without looking up, focused on grinding a blade against a stone wheel. Sparks rise with each pass. Lucius begins his duties without being told. He sweeps the floor carefully, gathering the fine dust and shavings into a pile. He organizes the tools, laying them out with precision. The chisels are arranged by size, the tongs by purpose. Everything in its place. The day's work begins slowly. Marcus shapes a hinge for a wealthy merchant's door. Lucius hands him tools, wipes sweat from his brow, and watches closely. The metal glows orange in the forge before being hammered into form. The sound is rhythmic, almost meditative. Marcus pauses occasionally to explain the metal's behavior, how different heat yields different malleability. Lucius nods, absorbing each word. He enjoys these quiet moments of instruction, even when few words are spoken. At midday, they rest. Marcus gestures toward the courtyard. Lucius retreats beneath the fig tree. He unwraps his lunch, another slice of bread, more olives, a boiled egg. He eats slowly, listening to the distant murmur of voices and the occasional bray of a donkey. Bees buzz lazily in the warm air. Lucius notices a snail making its slow way up the stone wall. He watches it for a while, amused by its determination. The stillness of the moment is calming. No need for speed, just observation. After lunch, Marcus leaves to make deliveries. Lucius is alone in the shop. He moves carefully, choosing a soft piece of wood to practice carving. His fingers are steady. He carves a small bird, its wings tucked, its beak slightly open. He imagines it perched on a windowsill, watching the world pass by. He wipes the carving clean and sets it aside. Then he files a piece of bronze, rounding its edges with patient strokes. The sound of the file against metal is soft, comforting. He works slowly, methodically, just as Marcus has taught him. A breeze stirs the cloth covering the window. It brings with it the scent of bread baking. Lucius pauses to breathe it in, his eyes half closed. The light shifts across the floor, and he watches the dust dance in the golden rays. Time passes gently. Lucius opens a scroll his master lent him, a simple guide on Roman joinery. He traces the illustrations with his finger, marveling at the clean joints, the locking teeth. He dreams of building a piece of furniture one day. The shop remains peaceful. Outside, the sun lowers. A neighbour's child walks by, singing softly. Lucius looks up from his work and smiles. He feels grown, trusted, important in his small tasks. As the sun dips lower in the sky, Marcus returns. He inspects Lucius's work, nodding in approval. They clean the workshop together, returning tools to their places, bank the coals in the forge, and shutter the windows. Before leaving, Marcus pulls out a wrapped cloth and hands it to Lucius. Inside is a small wooden plane, worn but functional. "Yours now," he says simply. Lucius bows his head, gratitude welling in his chest. The walk home is quiet. The streets are softer now, the heat of the day fading. Children play with a hoop and stick, their laughter echoing off the stone. A woman carries a basket of herbs. A dog dozes on a stoop. At home, Lucius washes his hands with water from the jug. His mother sets out a bowl of lentils and a crust of bread. They eat together, the silence companionable. His sister tells him about her day, how she found a shiny stone, how she watched a snail for nearly an hour. After dinner, Lucius sits near the hearth, carving another small figure. This one is a fish, its tail curved as if mid-swim. His mother knits. His sister sings softly to herself, curled up with a blanket and doll. His father arrives home from the fields, tired but smiling. He claps Lucius on the shoulder and joins the family. They talk quietly for a while, nothing grand, just the soft comfort of being together. Later, Lucius helps mend a loose stool leg. He and his father work side by side, fitting the pieces snugly. His father ruffles his hair afterward, proud. When the fire burns low, Lucius lays out his mat once more. He stretches, feeling the ache of the day in his shoulders and hands. Outside, the stars are beginning to show. The moon casts a faint glow through the open window. He listens to the quiet sounds of the city night, the creak of wood, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of wind through leaves. His eyelids grow heavy. He closes them, his breath slowing. Another day awaits tomorrow. But for now, Lucius sleeps. The next morning begins much the same, but Lucius is stirred earlier by a sharp knock at the door. A messenger from the forum has arrived. Marcus has requested Lucius accompany him today to help negotiate a new contract. This is a new responsibility, and Lucius feels a twinge of nervous pride. He dresses quickly and eats a hurried breakfast before meeting Marcus near the basilica. The forum bustles with early traders and civic officials. Marble columns loom overhead. They wait patiently by a vendor's stall. Marcus introduces Lucius to a magistrate's clerk who requires iron fittings for civic construction. Lucius listens as Marcus speaks, taking mental notes. He's learning the business side of craftsmanship, how to price, how to offer reliability. Later they stop at the baths. Marcus insists they clean before returning to the shop. The heat and steam relax Lucius, and he reflects on the morning's encounter while sitting on a stone bench. Older men gossip nearby, while a boy scrubs a wall with a cloth. The hum of voices and gentle splashing is like music. Returning to the workshop, Lucius finds a surprise. A former apprentice of Marcus, now a master himself, has come to visit. He brings with him a fine piece of carved oak, asking Marcus to inspect it. Lucius listens to them discuss craftsmanship techniques, the types of wood that hold detail best, the importance of patience in design. That afternoon, Lucius practices fitting 2 pieces of wood using a dovetail joint. It's difficult work. The angles must be perfect. His first try is loose, the second splits, but the third holds snugly, and Marcus offers a rare smile. Lucius also begins engraving a decorative border on a box. He marks the design with charcoal and begins with slow, careful cuts. His hand cramps, but he presses on. With every pass, he gains confidence. Marcus watches quietly from across the room. When the day ends, Lucius helps an elderly neighbor carry a bundle of firewood to her home. She thanks him with a small apple tart. He smiles, cheeks flushed with the kind of pride that doesn't need words. That night, as he lies on his mat, Lucius wonders about the future. Will he one day have his own shop? Will he teach an apprentice? His heart is full of possibility. Sleep comes quickly. The following week brings rain. The streets turn to mud. Lucius arrives soaked but smiling. The forge burns brighter against the grey sky. Raindrops drum against the shutters. Marcus uses the quiet day to teach Lucius how to repair a cracked blade. They heat, hammer, and temper it carefully. Lucius learns to listen for the subtle sounds of the metal. Later, he polishes it until the surface gleams. In the lull of the afternoon, Lucius sketches a design for a small box with a hidden compartment. He shows Marcus, who raises an eyebrow, then nods. "Try it," he says. Lucius spends the next few days cutting, fitting, and adjusting. The mechanism is tricky. It takes trial and error, and a few mistakes, but eventually the lid clicks shut and opens with a twist. He presents it to Marcus, who chuckles and says, "A craftsman and a clever one." One evening, Marcus invites Lucius to his home. It's modest, with shelves filled with scrolls and tools. They share bread, cheese, and wine. Marcus tells stories from his youth, of travel, mistakes, and lessons. Lucius listens intently, feeling closer to him than ever. At the end of that week, Marcus allows Lucius to work on a real client order without assistance, a set of drawer handles for a merchant. Lucius checks every measurement 3 times. He works slowly, sanding the edges to perfection. When the merchant arrives and approves them, Lucius feels like he's grown an inch taller. One evening, as the sun sets, Lucius walks through a nearby orchard. The air smells of damp soil and ripening fruit. He sits under an olive tree and watches the swallows dart across the fading sky. He thinks about how far he's come. He no longer counts days. He builds them. And each night, as he lays down to sleep, he carries the quiet pride of one who is learning his craft, not just with hands, but with heart. Lucius sleeps. The sun had just begun to stretch across the sky, its faint golden fingers reaching into Roma's small, humble cottage. The birds outside sang a soft, familiar song, as though urging her to wake. Roma lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet stirrings of the morning. The fire in the hearth had long since faded to embers, the only warmth now coming from the heavy quilt she shared with her mother. Roma's first task of the day was always the same. She gathered the small bundle of straw beside her bed, her fingers working quickly as she began to pull on her woolen socks. The chill of the morning air was always more biting than the sun's warmth could chase away. She dressed in the dark, quiet morning, aware of the world outside, still hushed and hidden beneath the early mist. She stepped quietly over the wooden floorboards, and then, with a deep breath, stepped outside. The streets were still quiet, save for the distant sounds of the blacksmith sharpening his tools and the low hum of farm animals beginning to stir. The cobbled streets were wet with dew, and the sky, although streaked with light, was still dim enough to feel as though the world was holding its breath. Roma's first stop was the well at the town centre. The water was icy cold, and she was careful to lower the bucket slowly, making sure the rope didn't scrape against the stone. As she drew the water, her mind wandered to the thought of what the day would bring. more work in the fields, preparing for the harvest. She was used to it now, the steady repetition of work and routine. She filled her bucket, bringing it back to the cottage with practiced ease. Roma made her way through the village square, her feet soft on the cobbled street, still wet from the morning dew. The town had only just begun to wake up, and the streets were quiet, save for the faint sounds of the town's early risers, farmers and tradespeople who had already started their work. Roma walked past the small cottages, the thatched roofs dripping with the last remnants of the night's mist. She passed the town's herbalist, a wizened old woman who had a small stall by the square. The woman was busy with a mortar and pestle, grinding something for an early customer. Roma smiled at the old woman, who glanced up from her work. "Ah, Roma, you're up early as always," she said in her raspy voice. Roma nodded, pausing for a moment to talk. "I thought I'd get a head start before the sun climbs higher." She looked down at the herbalist's stall, where jars of dried herbs and roots were neatly arranged. "What are you working on today?" The herbalist leaned in closer, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "A little something for the pains of the body. Not many know it, but the leaves of a certain plant can soothe your joints like nothing else. You won't find that in any book, my dear." Roma raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Do you think it works?" "Of course," the herbalist replied with a grin, her hands continuing their steady grinding. "We rely on the old knowledge, the plants that have been here long before we were." Roma smiled in appreciation, but didn't linger too long. She had her own tasks to complete. As she made her way to the town's edge, the sounds of a blacksmith hammering iron filled the air, the rhythmic clang echoing in the cool morning air. The scent of burning wood and hot metal filled her nostrils. There were no markets yet, no bustling crowds to jostle through, only the slow beginning of a new day, where everyone had their own part to play. She passed the mill, where the miller was already hard at work, grinding grain into flour. Not much had changed over the years, Roma thought. The rhythm of life, day in and day out, was as slow and steady as the flow of the river just beyond the town. It was a life of simplicity, but it was also a life that depended on patience. Patience to plant, to wait for the harvest, to grind the flour, to fix what broke, and to care for what could not be replaced. She stopped to greet a few others in the street, but soon her focus returned to the task at hand: work in the fields. By mid-morning, Roma found herself among the fields outside the town. The sky was clearer now, the sun slowly climbing higher in the sky, though the coolness of early autumn still lingered. She bent down to the earth, pulling weeds from around the crops. She used a simple, rusted tool, a hoe passed down from her grandmother. It was one of the few belongings she had inherited, and she took care of it as though it were a family heirloom. The rhythm of the work was calming. Roma's hands moved with practiced ease, pulling weeds from the earth, her muscles slowly warming as the sun crept higher in the sky. The sounds around her were familiar, distant calls of birds, the occasional grunt of a cow from the nearby pasture, and the hum of the wind through the trees. There was a peace in it all, a stillness that filled the air, broken only by the soft scrape of the hoe against the soil. As she worked, Roma thought back to her ancestors, those who had worked this very land centuries before her. They had walked this earth in the same way, with the same steady pace. The world had changed, certainly, but in many ways life in the Tudor village had remained unchanged. Her thoughts drifted as she continued working. She had heard tales of how, not too long ago, the villagers had used oxen to help plough the fields. Oxen were slower than horses, but they could carry a heavier load, making them the preferred choice for many. The ploughs they used were simple but effective, with blades that could tear through the thick soil. Yet these ploughs often broke, and villagers would need to mend them by hand, using their rudimentary tools. Roma smiled softly. It was strange how such simple tools were so essential to their way of life. There was something humbling in that, how little they had, but how much they relied on it to survive. By late afternoon, the harvest was in full swing. Roma, along with the other villagers, worked to gather the crops that had ripened under the late summer sun. She walked among the rows of golden grain, cutting it carefully with a sickle. The work was backbreaking, but there was something satisfying about it, the knowledge that the fruit of all the hard work was finally coming to fruition. The air was filled with the scent of fresh-cut grain and the gentle rustle of the crops swaying in the wind. Roma's hands were sore, the skin on her palms rough from hours of work, but she didn't mind. This was the rhythm of life, and it was the rhythm she knew best. As the day began to wind down, Roma glanced up at the setting sun, feeling the weight of the work in her bones. It had been a long day, but the harvest was necessary. It would provide food for the coming months, keeping her family sustained through the colder months. Without it, they would not survive the harsh winter ahead. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a soft amber glow over the village, Roma finished her work in the field. Her body was tired, the muscles in her back sore from bending and lifting all day. But as always, she felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. The work was hard, but it was the kind of work that connected her to the land and to the generations that had come before her. Roma wiped her brow and stood for a moment, looking out over the fields. The trees along the edge of the property swayed gently in the evening breeze, their leaves rustling softly. In the distance, she could hear the faint clamour of chickens and the low, comforting moo of cows being led back to their pens for the night. She walked slowly back toward the village, the cobblestones beneath her feet still damp from the morning dew. The cool air of the evening had begun to settle in, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The village was quiet, with only the faint sounds of the evening's chores echoing in the distance. The smell of burning wood from hearth fires filled the air, the warmth of home a welcome thought after a long day. As she approached the village square, she passed a small group of townsfolk gathered around the well. They were chatting softly, their voices a mix of gossip and laughter. One of the older men, a fisherman named Will, greeted her with a nod. "Long day, Roma?" he asked, his voice deep and gravelly. Roma smiled and nodded. "The harvest never stops, Will, but there's always something satisfying about seeing the fields ready for winter." Will chuckled softly. "Aye, it's always the same, year after year, but I reckon we all make it through, don't we?" Roma gave a soft laugh in return. "We do." She continued her walk home, passing by the bakery where the smell of freshly baked bread wafted out into the street. The baker, a woman named Maris, was already shutting the door for the night, a basket of warm loaves tucked under her arm. "Good evening, Roma," Maris called out with a warm smile. "I've saved a loaf for you. It's still warm if you'd like it." Roma's stomach rumbled at the thought of the warm, crusty bread, and she nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Maris. I'll take it." She felt a moment of relief, knowing dinner would be easy to prepare tonight. A loaf of bread and some vegetables from the garden would be a simple, comforting meal. She waved goodbye to Maris and continued her way home, the last of the day's light fading as the stars began to appear overhead. It was one of those nights where the air was still and quiet, as though the world itself was holding its breath. By the time Roma reached her cottage, the fire had been rekindled and the warm light of the hearth flickered through the small window. The scent of roasting vegetables and herbs filled the air, and Roma's mother, Anne, was sitting by the fire, stirring a pot of stew. "Roma, you're back just in time," Anne said with a smile, her voice warm and comforting. She was a woman of few words, but in the silence between them, Roma could always feel the deep bond they shared. Roma placed the loaf of bread on the small wooden table. "I brought some bread from Maris," she said, peeling off a crust and offering a piece to her mother. "Thank you, dear," Anne replied, breaking off a piece of bread for herself. "The stew is almost done. It'll be good to sit and eat tonight, after such a long day." They sat together, their meal simple but filling. The bread, still warm from the bakery, was a perfect accompaniment to the hearty stew. Roma dipped her bread into the broth, savouring the warmth and comfort it brought. As they ate, the conversation drifted between them, light and easy. Roma's thoughts turned to the day's work, but her mother always had a way of bringing her focus back to the present moment. They spoke of the weather, the coming harvest, and the small happenings in the village. "You know," Anne said thoughtfully between bites, "I heard from Jane today. She says the pigs are doing well. We might get some good pork this winter." Roma smiled softly. I'm glad to hear it. It'll be nice to have something different for a change. Anne chuckled. Aye, after all this bread and stew, it'll be a treat. The conversation drifted into silence, the only sound being the soft crackling of the fire. The slow, peaceful rhythms of their life filled the space between them. There was no rush, no hurry, just the quiet, steady passing of the hours, marking another day in the life of the Tudor town. The evening passed in its usual way, with Roma and her mother cleaning up the dishes, the warmth of the hearth a constant companion. As the fire began to burn low, Roma fetched her blanket from the small chest by the door. She had grown accustomed to the quiet of the night, the soft sound of the wind rustling the trees outside, the distant creak of the house settling into its nighttime rhythm. Before she lay down, Roma took a moment to gaze out the window. The moon was high in the sky now, its pale light casting a soft glow over the village. The streets were empty, the only movement being the occasional animal in the fields or the faint flicker of a distant fire. The stillness was calming, a reminder of how simple and slow life could be in the village. She lay down on her straw mattress, pulling the covers around her. The smell of the fire, the sound of the wind, and the quiet hum of the earth beneath her seemed to blend together, creating a sense of peace that filled her mind. Slowly, her thoughts began to drift, her body relaxed, and she felt her eyes grow heavy. Before long, the world outside faded into silence, and Roma, too, fell asleep, wrapped in the comforting embrace of the slow rhythms of Tudor life. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the cottage window, Roma awoke to another quiet day. The cycle of life in the Tudor town continued, slow and steady, with the same tasks, the same routines, but each day held its own small joys, its own moments of peace. As Roma prepared for another day of work in the fields, she knew that, though life was hard and filled with repetition, it was also filled with a certain kind of beauty. The slow, rhythmic pulse of the land, the quiet moments of connection with her family and the people of the village, all worked together to create a life that was simple but meaningful. And so, Roma's day began again, as it always had, and as it always would. The sun had barely crested the horizon, painting the sky with soft hues of pink and gold as Roma set out again to tend the fields. The damp earth beneath her feet felt cold at first, but the warmth of the rising sun soon began to chase away the chill. She walked slowly, taking in the peace of the morning. The birds were quiet, but the wind through the trees made a soft, rustling sound. It was a sound that soothed her, like an old friend's voice whispering in the background. Her basket hung loosely at her side, filled with seeds she would plant in the furrows. There was little time for rest this morning. Each step had a purpose. The plants wouldn't wait. It wasn't like the work of the harvest, where the earth provided its bounty at the right time. No, planting was the slower task. It took patience and faith in the earth, which, no matter how hard the seasons were, always found a way to grow something. Roma knelt in the dirt, her hands moving with methodical precision as she planted the small seeds one by one into the rows, the scent of fresh earth mixed with the sharp tang of herbs from the garden as the wind picked up again, stirring the tall grasses. Each movement was slow, deliberate, the weight of the day ahead pulling at her shoulders, but there was a quiet peace in the task. As Roma worked, she thought back to the stories her grandmother had told her as a child. Roma's family had lived in the village for generations, and the old ways had been passed down like treasures, hidden in the folds of everyday life. Her grandmother used to talk of how the village used to be different, how there were fewer homes, more open fields, and how the work had been harder but simpler in some ways. You must always remember, her grandmother would say in her quiet voice, that there's a rhythm to life here, Roma. It's slower than the city, slower than most places, but it's honest work. It has a flow. We plant when the season is right, we reap when the time comes, but don't forget to appreciate each part of it, for it is what keeps the world turning. Roma's grandmother had passed years ago, but her words still lingered in Roma's heart. She would work through the seasons, planting and harvesting, always mindful of the rhythms that her family had learned from the earth. The world outside the village had changed, new ideas, new inventions, but here, in the quiet town, the old ways still held sway. The market day was always a bit more bustling, though it was still a far cry from the busy, noisy marketplaces of larger towns. Roma walked toward the square, her basket in hand, filled with herbs and vegetables that she had harvested from the garden. The sky was overcast today, and the village looked a little less vibrant, though the faint scent of bread from the bakery and the sound of the blacksmith's hammer still filled the air. As Roma passed through the square, she saw the usual faces: the butcher, the baker, the candlemaker, all of them performing their daily work. The villagers had a way of greeting each other with nods and polite smiles, always respectful of the quiet bonds that held them together. She stopped by the herbalist's stall again, who greeted her with a wink. "You're early today," the herbalist said, as she carefully arranged bundles of dried lavender and sage. "You must be getting used to the routine now." Roma smiled, placing the herbs she had brought to sell onto the counter. "The work in the fields keeps me busy, but the herbs are ready for the market, and so here I am." The herbalist gave her a knowing look. "You know, my dear, not many folks around here know the true power of some of these plants. You'd be surprised how many people could learn from you." She motioned to the dried flowers and herbs, each one placed carefully in its jar. The remedy for aches and pains, the herbs for a good night's rest, all of it. You'd be wise to remember what your grandmother taught you. Roma nodded, the weight of her grandmother's teaching settling heavily in her thoughts. "I will," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I always do." The two women exchanged a few more words before Roma moved on, making her way through the square. The town was slowly filling up with people, and the marketplace had become a quiet hub of commerce and conversation. Still, there was no rush, no hurry. The work was done at a steady pace, each task following the last like clockwork. As the day began to wind down, Roma found herself back at the cottage. The soft evening light streamed through the window, casting gentle shadows on the walls. Her mother, Anne, was already preparing the evening meal, a simple stew with root vegetables, the aroma filling the room. Roma took a moment to breathe, to appreciate the warmth of home. There was something about the quiet, the steady hum of life in the village that always brought her a sense of peace. No matter how busy the day had been, there was always a moment when everything slowed down, when the evening wrapped itself around her like a blanket. They sat together at the table, eating in silence for a while. There was no need for words. The meal was humble, but it filled them both. The fire crackled softly in the corner, the flames casting a soft glow on their faces. The quiet rhythm of their lives settled over them as the world outside grew darker and the stars began to appear in the night sky. The evening was calm, and as the last embers of the fire began to fade, Roma finished her tasks for the day. She tucked herself into her bed, the warm blankets enveloping her, the soft rustling of leaves outside the window, the faint hoot of an owl, the distant murmur of the village, all blended together into a peaceful lullaby. As she closed her eyes, she thought about the simple beauty of her life, the work, the quiet routines, the bonds of family and community. They all formed the steady rhythm that she had come to rely on. There was a certain comfort in knowing that life would continue at its own pace, regardless of the changes in the world beyond the village. Roma felt herself drift off to sleep, her mind at peace with the world around her as the night continued its slow, quiet passage. The first chill of winter had arrived. The days were shorter and the sun seemed to sink lower into the sky each evening. Roma could feel the change in the air, the quiet cold creeping in through the gaps in the walls and under the doorframe. It was a subtle shift, but one that marked the end of the harvest and the beginning of the long wait for spring. Roma spent her days preparing for the winter months. It was a time of slow, repetitive work, but the tasks were important, ensuring there would be enough firewood to last through the cold months, storing away the last of the preserved vegetables, and checking the roof for any leaks that might let the wind in. She worked alongside her mother, who had lived through many winters, and knew that every task, no matter how small, was a necessary part of survival. The wind howled softly outside, but inside the cottage there was warmth. The hearth had been stoked with fresh logs, and the fire crackled steadily, filling the room with a comforting glow. Roma sat beside the fire, mending clothes with a needle and thread, her fingers moving with quiet concentration. Her mother, Anne, was bustling around the small kitchen, chopping dried herbs to add to a pot of soup simmering on the stove. The smell of the broth, thick with root vegetables and herbs, made Roma's stomach rumble. Despite the cold outside, the warmth in the cottage was enough to make her feel content. "Roma," her mother said softly, her voice gentle, "you've been working hard all day. Come, sit for a moment." Roma smiled and set aside her sewing. She sat at the table and her mother poured her a cup of warm tea, steeped with thyme and honey. It was soothing, the warmth spreading from her chest to her limbs. It was a simple comfort, but one that meant everything in the quiet of the winter. They sat together, sipping their tea and exchanging quiet words. There was no need for more conversation. The peace of the moment spoke louder than anything else. Winter nights were long in the village. By the time evening settled, the sun was already hidden behind the hills, and the darkness seemed to stretch on for hours. In the stillness, there was a kind of beauty. Everything slowed down. The world outside was asleep, covered by a blanket of frost, and inside, the hearth was the only source of light. Roma would sit with her mother by the fire, both of them wrapped in thick woolen blankets. The fire cast flickering shadows on the walls, and the room felt small, intimate, as though they were the only two people in the world. There was something deeply calming about the darkness and the firelight, a reminder of how little they needed to feel content. The stillness of the evening was broken only by the occasional creak of the house as it settled, or the distant call of an owl. Roma would listen to the quiet and feel the weight of the world slow down around her. Outside, the village was silent, the houses huddled together against the cold. The nights were the time for reflection, for letting the day's work slip away, and for remembering the generations who had lived in the village before them. Roma often thought about her ancestors, those who had endured winters much harsher than this one. Her grandmother's stories echoed in her mind, and she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the rhythm of life that had sustained them all. The 1st of January arrived quietly, as it always did. The village, still wrapped in the deep quiet of winter, barely stirred. Only the faintest traces of movement could be seen in the streets. Villagers carrying firewood, or the blacksmith opening his workshop for another day of work. The new year, like all things in the village, arrived without fanfare. There were no grand celebrations, no bustling crowds or fireworks, just the steady continuation of life as it had always been. Roma spent the day as she always did, helping her mother with the morning chores, tending to the hearth and preparing for the day's work. It was a quiet kind of New Year, marked not by loud celebrations, but by the simple acts of living. The days were still short, the nights long, and there was plenty to be done. As the evening fell, Roma sat beside the fire once again. Her mother had put together a simple meal, a stew of beans, root vegetables, and a few herbs. The scent of the food filled the room, and for a moment Roma closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the fire and the quiet of the night settle into her bones. Winter in the Tudor village was quiet in a way that was almost sacred. The snow, when it came, would blanket the village in a soft white silence. The usual sounds of the village, laughter, chatter, the thud of hammers, were replaced by a deep hush. The world outside seemed to disappear under the snow, and the only sound that could be heard was the crunch of footsteps in the frozen earth. Roma would walk through the village in the morning, her breath visible in the cold air, and feel as though she was the only one left in the world. The streets were empty, save for the occasional figure trudging through the snow, bundled up against the cold. The trees stood still, their branches heavy with frost, and the houses were wrapped in layers of snow, as though the world had been paused. At night, the stars were brighter than ever, the air so clear that it seemed to sparkle with cold. Roma would often take a moment to gaze up at the sky, lost in the vastness of it all. The quiet of winter had a way of making her feel small, but in the most peaceful way. It was a time for slowing down, for reflecting on the year that had passed and the year to come. As the winter months passed, Roma felt the first stirrings of spring. The days grew longer, and the air began to warm just slightly. The snow began to melt, revealing the frozen earth beneath, which slowly started to thaw. It was a slow, gradual change, but it was one that Roma always looked forward to. The first signs of life returning to the earth, the sight of buds on the trees, the sound of birds beginning to sing again, were small but important. Roma knew that the next harvest would soon begin, and with it, the cycle of life would start again. But for now, there was still the quiet of winter to enjoy. The rhythms of the village, the simple work of each day would continue as they always had. And though the seasons changed, the steadiness of life in the Tudor village remained the same. Roma sat by the fire one evening, watching the last of the winter's chill slip away, and felt a sense of peace wash over her. No matter what came, no matter how the world beyond the village changed, the rhythms of life in the village would endure. The first days of spring arrived slowly, as if the earth itself was stretching out of a long, peaceful slumber. The frost that had held the village in its icy grip for months began to melt, revealing patches of brown earth beneath the snow. Roma stepped outside one early morning, her boots sinking slightly into the damp ground. The air smelled of wet earth and the faint, fresh scent of growing things. It was a soft, quiet awakening, a sign that the earth was ready to begin anew. Roma paused for a moment, gazing at the fields. The land looked barren still, but the soil was softening, slowly warming with the touch of the sun. Soon, she would be planting again. But for now, there was only the quiet promise of the coming season. She walked along the village path, her feet light on the wet ground, and noticed the first signs of life, small green shoots pushing through the soil where the snow had once lain thick. The crocuses, their purple and yellow petals delicate, had bloomed near the village's edge, their colours bright against the grey earth. A robin perched on a nearby fence post, singing a soft, cheerful tune, as if welcoming the change in the air. Roma bent down to touch the earth, the cool moisture of it seeping into her fingers. It was a reminder of the work that lay ahead. The cycle would continue, but for now, there was the quiet moment of transition when the world held its breath, waiting for spring to take hold. The days grew longer, and the warmth of spring spread slowly across the village. Roma's life fell back into the familiar rhythm of planting. She rose with the dawn, as she always had, but now the sun was already climbing higher when she stepped outside. The chill in the morning air was gone, replaced by a cool freshness that made the work in the fields feel lighter, more hopeful. Roma's hands moved deftly as she worked the land. The soft soil was easy to break up now, not like the frozen earth of winter. She took a small spade and dug small holes into the ground, placing seeds into the earth with a careful hand. Each seed, whether it was for herbs or vegetables, was important, and Roma treated it with the reverence it deserved. The scent of freshly turned earth filled her senses, and she paused for a moment to enjoy it. There was something grounding about working with the land, something that made her feel connected to the generations who had done the same before her. She could almost hear her grandmother's voice in her ear, urging her to work the soil with care, for it was the earth that would sustain them all through the seasons. Roma spent the day working in the fields, her movements steady and familiar. The sunlight warmed her back as she laboured, but she never rushed. There was no hurry in the process, only the patient waiting for the seeds to take root and grow. The quiet hum of nature filled the space between her thoughts, and she found herself lost in the rhythm of it all, the digging, the planting, the quiet watching as the earth absorbed the seeds she had placed. As the fields began to show signs of life, so too did the village. The market square, which had been quiet through the winter, was once again a place of trade and conversation. People from the surrounding villages arrived to sell their wares, jars of honey, dried meats, and baskets of early vegetables, and the square began to bustle with activity. Roma walked to the market with a basket full of the first herbs she had gathered from the garden: thyme, rosemary, and sage. The herbalist's stall was busy, and Roma set down her basket alongside it, exchanging a few words with the woman. "It's good to see the market alive again," Roma said, her voice soft with the peace of the season. "Indeed," the herbalist replied, her hands working quickly to arrange bundles of herbs. "The spring always brings a bit more energy with it, doesn't it? You can feel it in the air. It's like the earth is waking up, stretching out of its long sleep." Roma smiled. She had always loved the quiet energy of the spring market. It was lively, but not rushed. There was time for small talk, time to catch up with neighbours, and time to appreciate the changing world. As the morning passed, the sun grew warmer and more people filled the square. Roma greeted a few familiar faces, sharing the simple joys of spring, talk of the planting, the weather, and what the coming harvest might bring. The quiet rhythm of the village had returned, and with it, the sense of community that held the village together. One morning, as Roma sat by the window, working on the final stages of mending a cloak, she heard the soft, unmistakable sound of birds singing in the trees. The song was gentle, a delicate melody carried on the spring breeze. Roma paused her work, listening for a moment, her mind quieting as she focused on the sounds of the birds. It was a song she had heard every year at this time, and yet it always felt new. The birds seemed to be singing not just for the coming of spring, but for the simple joy of being alive in such a peaceful world. The sound wrapped around her like a soft blanket, filling the quiet moments with a gentle sense of harmony. Roma stood up and walked outside, following the song of the birds. The village had begun to stir. She could hear the faint sound of a child laughing, the distant murmur of conversation. But it was the birds' song that caught her attention, their chorus rising in the morning air. She stood in the yard, letting the song wash over her. The birds perched in the branches of the tall trees at the edge of the garden, their feathers flitting in the breeze. The sky above was a pale blue, and the sun, though still rising, had already warmed the air. Roma closed her eyes for a moment, letting the song fill her soul. There was peace in it, a rhythm that echoed the pulse of the earth itself. Everything around her was alive, and in this moment she felt a deep connection to it all: the birds, the earth, the village, and the endless cycle of seasons. As spring moved into early summer, the weather grew warmer and the earth began to fill with new life. But with this warmth came an occasional shift in the air, a warning of storms. Roma had learned to recognize these shifts, the way the air would feel heavier before a storm rolled in, the way the birds would quiet and the sky would darken. One afternoon, as Roma worked in the garden, the first rumblings of thunder echoed across the sky. The birds fell silent and the wind began to pick up, blowing through the trees with increasing force. Roma paused in her work, glancing up at the sky. It was clear that a storm was on the way. She hurried inside, gathering her tools and securing what she could in the small shed. The wind howled outside, and the first raindrops began to fall, soft at first, then harder as the storm gathered strength. The sound of the rain against the roof and the wind whipping through the trees filled the air, but inside the cottage, Roma felt safe and secure. As the storm raged outside, Roma sat by the hearth, her hands idle for the first time in days. The fire crackled softly, and her mother hummed a quiet tune as she worked by the fire. They did not speak much, but in the stillness of the storm, there was a quiet comfort in simply being together. The storm had passed as suddenly as it had arrived. By morning the sky had cleared, and the sun shone through the mist left behind by the heavy rain. The world outside had changed. Everything was washed clean, the earth damp and cool beneath Roma's feet. The storm had brought with it a sense of renewal, a feeling that the world was once again beginning fresh. Roma stepped outside, taking a deep breath of the crisp air. The scent of wet earth filled her lungs, mingling with the faint smell of flowers beginning to bloom in the garden. Everything was alive again, the colours brighter now after the storm. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves glistening with raindrops, and the flowers in the fields had been washed clean of dust and dirt. Roma walked toward the garden, her boots crunching softly on the wet ground. The rain had soaked the soil, and she could already see the seeds she had planted beginning to sprout. Green shoots poked out of the earth, delicate and fragile, but full of promise. She knelt down to touch the soil, her fingers sinking into the damp ground. There was something deeply satisfying about seeing her work begin to bear fruit, even if only in small, quiet ways. As the days stretched on, the earth continued to warm, and Roma's work in the garden took on a steady rhythm. The early crops she had planted, the peas, the lettuce, the radishes, began to grow, their green leaves unfurling in the soft spring air. Roma spent hours each day tending to them, making sure they had enough water, pulling the weeds that threatened to overtake them, and ensuring the soil was soft enough for the plants to take root. Each day felt like a continuation of the last, a quiet unfolding of the seasons. The work was repetitive, yes, but there was peace in it. The steady rhythm of planting, tending, and harvesting connected her to something ancient, something that had been passed down through generations. Every time she pulled a radish from the soil or picked a few leaves of lettuce, it felt like a small victory, a reminder that the world was still turning, still growing. Roma spent her days alone in the garden or walking to the market, selling the first of her harvest. She would often return to her mother with baskets of fresh vegetables, their bright colours a welcome contrast to the pale earth. Together, they would prepare meals from the harvest, the simple act of chopping and cooking filling their evenings with warmth. Though the days were long, they passed in the quiet company of the seasons. It was a life without hurry, without great events or sweeping changes. Each day was simply another piece of the ongoing rhythm of life in the village. By mid-June, the earth had fully embraced summer. The sun shone hot and bright, and the days grew longer, stretching far into the evening. Roma spent more time outside now, working in the garden, walking the fields, and occasionally visiting with the other villagers. The slow, steady pace of life continued, but now the air was warmer, filled with the promise of a rich harvest. One evening, as Roma walked back from the market, she noticed how late the sun had set. It hung low in the sky, painting the clouds with shades of orange and pink. The village was quiet, save for the soft hum of insects in the air. Roma took a deep breath, savouring the moment of peace before the final light of the day disappeared. At the end of the village road, she saw a group of children playing near the well. Their laughter floated on the warm evening air, a reminder of the simple joys that filled the days. Roma smiled softly, her heart full as she watched them. It was a fleeting moment, but one that was etched in her memory. She continued on her way home, the warmth of the sun still lingering on her skin. The earth was full of life now, full of the steady rhythm that had been established long ago and which would continue long after she was gone. The next season brought with it a new chapter in Roma's life. It wasn't a sudden change, but a gradual shift. As the summer grew hotter and the days longer, Roma began to notice new things, things that weren't there before. The soil seemed richer, more fertile, and the work in the fields seemed lighter somehow. The village, too, was changing in subtle ways. The arrival of new neighbours, the birth of a few children, and the soft hum of new beginnings made Roma realize that the village itself was in constant motion, even when it seemed like it stood still. One morning, after a long day of work, Roma sat on the porch of her cottage, watching the sun set over the hills. The sky was streaked with deep purples and pinks, and the air was still. She thought of the future, the seasons ahead, the work that would need to be done, and yet, in that moment, she felt a deep sense of peace. Roma knew that the rhythms of her life, the simple daily tasks and the quiet routines would continue, but she also realized that life was never truly still. Even in the slow, steady pace of the village, change was always on the horizon, waiting to bring something new, something unexpected. For now, Roma was content. The village was her home, the earth her companion, and the slow passage of time a reminder that life, no matter how simple, was always full of beauty. It wasn't the grand events that mattered most, it was the quiet moments, the morning light, the evening sky, the steady pulse of the seasons that made life worth living. As summer began to fade, the cycle of life in the village continued. Roma found herself again in the garden, planting the seeds for the next harvest. The rhythm of her days was simple, but it was full. The earth was still her connection to the past, to the land that had sustained generations before her. The quiet passing of time was no burden, it was a gift. Roma knew that each day was part of something much larger, something far older than her, than the village, than the seasons themselves. And with that knowledge, she worked the land, tended to the earth, and lived in peace with the world around her. In the quiet, rhythmic life she led, Roma found not just survival, but fulfillment. There was no rush to get anywhere. She was exactly where she needed to be. As summer stretched on, the fields began to show their bounty. Roma had spent countless hours in the sun, her skin darkening with each passing day. The work was hard. and the heat of the sun made every task feel heavier. Yet, there was a quiet joy in it, a deep sense of fulfillment as the plants she had nurtured with her own hands began to grow tall. The sunflowers, which she had planted early in the season, now stood proud in the garden, their yellow faces turned toward the sky. The peas were ripe for picking, their tendrils curling around the vines like a child's hands grasping for something they couldn't quite reach. Roma picked the peas carefully, savoring the moment before the next crop would take their place in the earth. The garden was full of life now, lush and green with the fruits of her labor. The vegetables, fruits, and herbs she had planted grew strong in the rich soil, their roots entwining with the earth as if they too had found their place in the world. But as the harvest drew near, there were signs that change was coming. It wasn't something that could be seen at first, only felt, a subtle shift in the air, a change in the wind that carried with it a sense of anticipation. Roma had grown accustomed to the steady pace of life in the village, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was on the horizon. One evening, as the sun began to set, Roma was sitting on the steps of her cottage, watching the last light of the day fade. The sky was deepening into shades of purple and orange when she heard footsteps approaching. She turned to see her neighbor, a young woman named Eliza, walking toward her. "Good evening, Roma," Eliza greeted, her voice friendly but tinged with the weight of something unspoken. Roma smiled warmly. "Evening, Eliza. What brings you out this way?" Eliza paused for a moment, glancing back down the lane before stepping closer. "I wanted to speak with you about something," she began, her voice low. "There's a meeting at the town square tomorrow, a gathering of sorts. It's about changes in the village." Roma tilted her head, curious. "Changes? What kind of changes?" Eliza hesitated, her eyes darting toward the distant market square. "I'm not sure. There's talk about the village needing more resources, more organization. I think they might want to bring in new ways of doing things." Roma's brow furrowed. She had lived in the village her entire life, and though there had been small changes over the years, they had always been gradual, quiet. This sudden shift felt foreign to her, as if it was something that didn't quite belong in their slow-moving world. "Are you going?" Roma asked. "I think I'll attend," Eliza replied. "It's strange to me too, but change is happening all around. It might be time to see what it's all about." Roma considered this for a moment. She had always been content with the steady rhythm of her life, her daily routines, the seasons, the simple acts of planting, growing, and harvesting. Change wasn't something she had ever welcomed, but perhaps it was inevitable. "I'll go with you," Roma said quietly. "I think I need to see for myself." The next day, Roma made her way to the town square, her steps slower than usual. The air was warm, and the sun had returned to its high place in the sky. There was a buzz in the village, a hum of excitement that filled the air. People were gathering in small groups, speaking in hushed tones, glancing toward the center of the square where a few men had set up a makeshift platform. Roma stood with Eliza near the back of the crowd, watching as the townsfolk gathered. There was an unfamiliar energy to the atmosphere, one that made Roma uneasy. She had always trusted the natural flow of things, the cycles of the seasons, the slow march of time. But this felt different. The man at the front of the crowd, a local trader named Thomas, cleared his throat to address the gathering. "Good people of the village," he began, his voice carrying over the crowd. "We stand on the precipice of a new age. The times are changing, and it's time for us to adapt." Roma exchanged a glance with Eliza. "What is he talking about?" she whispered. "I don't know," Eliza replied, her eyes fixed on the platform. "But it sounds serious." Thomas continued. "We've been living in isolation for too long. We need to organize our efforts better, work together in ways we haven't before. New farming techniques, new trade routes, more efficient ways of gathering resources. There's talk of bringing in more people from other regions, expanding the town to increase our reach." Roma's heart began to race. Change had always been slow, almost imperceptible, but now it seemed as though the very foundation of her quiet world was being threatened. People spoke of new farming techniques, of strangers from distant lands, of expansion and growth. It felt like the world she knew, the rhythms of the earth, the quiet flow of village life, was slipping away. But despite the unease in her heart, Roma knew she could not turn away from this moment. Change, like the seasons, would come whether she welcomed it or not. Over the next few days, the mood in the village shifted. There was a restless energy that filled the air, and the steady rhythm of everyday life seemed to falter. People began to talk more openly about the changes that were coming, and the future felt uncertain. Roma found herself spending more time in the fields, working the soil, tending to the crops that had become her solace. The land had always been her constant, and in its quiet rhythms she found comfort. But now, even as she worked, her mind wandered to the future that was being shaped before her eyes. One morning, as Roma walked the familiar paths of the fields, her thoughts were interrupted by Eliza, who came running toward her with a look of determination on her face. "Roma," she called, her voice full of excitement, "I've made a decision. I'm going to leave the village. They're offering people from other places a chance to work together. It sounds like an opportunity for something bigger than what we have here." Roma stopped in her tracks, her heart heavy. She had known Eliza long enough to know that this was not a decision made lightly. "You're leaving?" Roma asked softly. "Yes," Eliza replied, her eyes filled with both uncertainty and hope. "It's a chance for something different, something more. I feel like the old ways aren't enough anymore. The world is changing, Roma. Maybe it's time we change with it." Roma stood in silence, the weight of her thoughts pressing against her chest. Change had come, whether she was ready for it or not. Her mind flickered to the steady rhythm of life in the village, the quiet mornings, the hard work in the fields, the peace of knowing what tomorrow would bring. But Eliza was right. The world beyond their small village was shifting, and Roma could feel the pull. "I'll stay," Roma said quietly. I think the old ways are still worth holding on to, but I understand why you're going. I'm not sure if I could leave this life behind." Eliza nodded, her eyes full of understanding. "I'll miss this place, but I think it's time to try something new. We each have our path to follow." As the days turned to weeks, Roma continued her work in the fields, the steady rhythm of the earth beneath her hands offering a sense of comfort in uncertain times. The world around her was changing, but she still had the land, still had the cycles of nature to anchor her. The village remained in the grip of change, and the future was uncertain. But in the quiet moments as Roma worked the earth, she found peace. The seasons would continue, the crops would grow, and life, though ever-changing, would always find its rhythm. The sun rose slowly over the town of Wickmere, casting long, pale beams across the uneven cobblestones of the village square. It was a mild morning, not too warm and not too cool, just the kind of weather that made wool shawls comfortable, and the scent of baked barley bread hang gently in the air. The market stalls were still being assembled, as they always were on a Monday. Wooden carts creaked as they were rolled into place, some a bit more stubborn than others, their wheels thick with last week's mud. The canvas canopies fluttered as merchants tied them to posts with fingers made stiff by the morning air. The sound of a sleepy rooster crowing from somewhere behind the apothecary drifted across the square, followed by the occasional clang of a metal pot being set down too firmly on a wooden plank. At the herb stall, Agnes the seller arranged bunches of rosemary, sage, and thyme into tiny bundles, binding them loosely with twine. She muttered to herself as she worked, mostly about the weather, or the dampness in her knees, or the fact that her son had forgotten, again, to scrub the bottom of the cartwheels. A few early passers-by stopped to sniff the lavender or finger the dried nettles, but no one bought anything just yet. Not far from her, Oswin the potter sat on a three-legged stool behind a row of modest earthenware bowls. He didn't say much, but he nodded occasionally when someone glanced in his direction. His prices hadn't changed in 3 years. 1 bowl for 2 copper coins, or 2 bowls and a plate in exchange for a clean wool scarf, so long as the scarf had no holes and wasn't dyed red. He didn't like red. No one asked why anymore. A woman with a squeaky cart sold pickled beets and small jugs of turnip ale. She set out tiny samples in clay cups. Most customers took the sample and walked away, murmuring something polite. One man claimed he would return after checking on his cousin's goat. He did not return. He never did. The woman didn't seem to mind. Children wandered through the stalls, eyeing the sweets sold by Jory, the sugar candy maker. His boiled confections were cloudy, misshapen little things, mint and rose water, and something he swore was lemon, but they melted slowly on the tongue and kept a child quiet for nearly half an hour. He liked to trade them for thimbles, bits of string, or whatever trinkets the children brought from home. He had, over time, amassed a small pile of buttons shaped like birds and coins too worn to spend. At the far edge of the square, Matilda and her sister sold second-hand smocks and tunics, folded into neat piles that had to be refolded every time the wind picked up. Their prices were firm, but they would make exceptions for people they liked, or for news that amused them. This morning, a miller's daughter whispered that the baker's youngest had been seen holding hands with the brewer's apprentice by the grain sacks. That bought a threadbare apron for half the usual price. Nearby, two old men argued gently over the cost of goose fat. One claimed last week it had been a coin cheaper. The other insisted it hadn't, and that the first man simply forgot. Neither seemed truly concerned. They left together, still murmuring about prices and memory, and paused to admire a stall with wooden spoons carved into odd shapes, none of which were particularly useful. The town bell rang softly in the distance. 10 chimes, not loud, just enough to mark the hour. Most people ignored it. A dog barked once and then stopped. Somewhere, someone dropped a bundle of carrots. Later, near the bread stall, gossip floated gently through the morning air like flour dust. Someone's cousin had lost a hen. Someone else said the Reeves cloak looked a little too fine for his station. No one said anything too scandalous. No one said anything too new. As the morning drew on, the market remained much the same. Small exchanges, slow steps, the same phrases repeated with quiet familiarity. How much for this? Will you take half? That's all I have, truly. The hum of the marketplace was constant but soft, coins clinking, shoes scuffing on the stones, soft chatter between neighbours. Nothing urgent, nothing unexpected, just another ordinary market day with slightly bruised apples, half-bargained turnips, forgotten promises, and slow-moving clouds above it all. And in time, as the sun tilted just a bit higher in the sky, the air grew warmer, and everything softened further. The colours, the sounds, the motion. Even the rumours began to slow. Even the gossip began to fade. Even the market, eventually, drifted into stillness. A woman in a faded green shawl examined a basket of onions for the 3rd time. She turned them one by one, pressing her thumb gently against the skin to test for softness. The seller, a wiry man with a crooked cap, said nothing. He had learned long ago that buyers preferred silence while they pondered. After a long moment, the woman picked 2 onions, paid in exact change, and left without a word. The man adjusted his cap and went back to peeling a potato with a small knife he kept in his pocket. Further down the lane, a boy with a missing shoe tried to trade a smooth pebble for a piece of soft cheese. The cheesemonger, a kindly woman named Breda, smiled and said she'd take the pebble only if it was lucky. The boy promised it was. She gave him the cheese anyway. She put the pebble in a small box under her stool where she kept other strange trades. A bent spoon, a feather shaped like a question mark, and a thimble with someone's initials carved into it. The sun inched higher, casting slow shadows across the bread stall. Loaves sat in careful stacks, round barley loaves, narrow rye sticks, and the occasional misshapen batch that the baker's apprentice had over-kneaded. Those were cheaper. A man with a limp bought 2 of the crooked loaves and didn't ask for change. He was given a 3rd one for free. No one mentioned it. Nearby, 3 women compared the prices of eggs from 2 stalls, even though the difference was only half a coin. They went back and forth several times, changing their minds, then finally bought from both sellers, to be fair. Later, they stood under the shade of an overhanging cloth and spoke at length about the mayor's horse, which had developed a limp and was now said to favour the left leg. One of them claimed it was because the mayor fed him boiled oats instead of raw. No one argued. 2 carts down, a man sold lengths of rope, all sizes, short, medium and long, coiled and tied with bits of leather string. Some ropes were dyed blue from old wool vats. He didn't call out to customers. He just sat, polishing a wooden bead and listening to the soft clatter of hooves passing in the distance. His only sale that morning was to a farmer who needed rope to tie his gate. The two men talked about knots for nearly 10 minutes before exchanging goods. They didn't rush. At a small stall draped in a faded blue cloth, an older woman named Elgiva sold sewing needles and small bundles of thread. Her fingers were bent with age, and she moved slowly, but she had a memory for faces and always remembered who preferred blue, who liked black, and who once complained about scratchy wool. She asked after a child's cold. She inquired about someone's cousin's toothache. When she didn't sell anything, she simply sat and embroidered the corner of a handkerchief over and over in tiny, neat loops. Down the row, a man with too many chickens tried to sell them, but they kept fluttering out of the cage. One escaped and ran under a stall, flapping its wings in slow, awkward bursts. No one rushed to catch it. Eventually, it wandered back, and the man scooped it up with a sigh. A little girl clapped softly. Her mother told her to hush. A soft breeze picked up in the afternoon. The stalls swayed gently, creaking on their ropes. A merchant who sold wax candles complained about the wind making his flames sputter. He relit one wick 5 times before giving up. His candles, mostly yellow and smelling faintly of beeswax, sat untouched for most of the morning. Around noon, a priest bought one and asked if he could pay with dried figs. The merchant accepted. A lull settled over the market then, as it often did after midday. People wandered more slowly, stalls grew quieter, a few merchants sat down, rubbing their knees. The hum of activity dulled to a murmur, soft footsteps, low voices, the occasional clang of something being dropped. 2 dogs dozed in a patch of sun near the tannery stall. No one moved them, no one minded. They were always there, and they always left just before dusk. In the corner of the square, a man with a wheeled cart was selling ink and paper, both in short supply. He displayed small bottles with crooked corks and narrow scrolls of parchment wrapped in string. Most buyers came not to purchase, but to ask if he had news from the next town over. He didn't, but he said he might next week. By the cheese stall, Breda had taken to humming softly, a tune with no beginning and no end. It drifted between the stalls like smoke, mixing with the scent of herbs and old apples. Her melody was picked up briefly by a man who sold spoons, who tapped his display table in rhythm with her hum. No one noticed but him. A merchant with belts and buckles called out to no one in particular, offering half price on leather goods. A child nearby picked up a tiny belt that fit around her wrist. The merchant let her keep it, then went back to eating a fig. The shadows began to lengthen. Some stalls began packing early, others lingered, hopeful for one last trade. A woman traded 3 turnips for a broken comb. Someone else bought a chipped mug with a drawing of a bird on the side. As the hour crept on, more gossip floated lazily between stalls. The baker's nephew had been seen talking to the cooper's niece. The Reeves' assistant had fallen asleep during his own inspection. Someone's uncle claimed to have invented a better way to stack firewood. No one believed him. The bell chimed once more, low, distant and slow, and still the market continued. Quietly, gently, the people bartered. Softly, patiently, they traded, until gradually the stalls emptied. The herbs were bundled back into sacks, the onions were packed in crates, the candy man gathered up his buttons and tucked them into a cloth bag. Elgiva folded her handkerchief and smoothed the edges. She smiled at nothing in particular, and the market square grew quieter. The breeze settled, the stones cooled, and all that was left were the faintest traces of footsteps, the memory of coins, and the lingering hush of an ordinary day, unfolding, fading, and finally resting. As the light dimmed a little more, and the shadows beneath the stalls grew long and soft, a merchant who sold old books appeared at the far end of the square. He came late every week, never in a rush. His cart was covered in a patchwork cloth stitched from bits of wool and linen. He always set out 5 books, no more, no less. Their spines were worn, their pages yellowed. Some were missing covers. One was a cookbook with no measurements. One was a collection of prayers in a language no one spoke anymore. He never offered prices. He waited for people to ask. A schoolboy stopped to look, tracing the edge of a page with his thumb. He had no coins, but the bookkeeper gave him a tiny volume on birds anyway, said he had 3 more at home just like it. The boy promised to return it, but the merchant only smiled and waved him off. Back near the bread stall, the baker's wife had come to collect the remaining loaves. She tucked them into a linen cloth and shook her head at the apprentice, who had been caught feeding crumbs to the pigeons again. "They'll come back every week now," she muttered. The apprentice shrugged and pointed out that they already did. Neither of them raised their voice. 2 boys walked past, each carrying a string of wooden beads. They had traded them earlier for 2 bruised apples and a single boiled egg. They weren't quite sure if they had made a good deal, but they didn't seem to mind. They talked quietly about whether or not the beads could be boiled into tea. They were almost certain they couldn't. A woman selling woolen caps adjusted her shawl and stood silently behind her stall. She hadn't made a sale all day, but she didn't seem disappointed. She rearranged her caps in neat rows, brown, grey, a few faded blue, and tied a little ribbon around the nicest one. A man passed by, glanced once, and kept walking. She watched him go, then adjusted the cap with the ribbon again. The lamplighter walked by slowly, though it was still a little early for his rounds. He greeted the merchants he knew with a nod and a soft tap of his walking stick on the stones. His stick made a rhythmic clack, clack, clack that echoed gently. He paused at the candlemaker's stall and bought a stubby taper, said it was for his own table, nothing fancy. The candlemaker offered 2 for 1, and the lamplighter accepted with a grateful grunt. A pair of women, wrapped in long cloaks, stopped to admire a tray of polished stones. The stones had no clear purpose, too small for grinding, too smooth for sharpening, but the seller said they were calming to hold. One of the women bought a blue-grey one that reminded her of rain. She tucked it into her pocket and said nothing more. In one quiet corner, an old man played a slow tune on a reed flute. He wasn't part of the market exactly. He didn't have a stall, but he came every week and sat on the same step, playing the same tune. No one paid him. No one asked him to leave. Children sometimes dropped bits of food near him, an apple core, a crumb of cheese, a broken biscuit. He smiled with his eyes closed and played on. As the day leaned softly into evening, the pace of things slowed further. Stalls closed one by one. The canvas canopies were folded, the tables collapsed, the baskets stacked. A few merchants lingered, chatting with neighbours, trading idle thoughts about whether the next market day would bring more customers or more rain. The woman who sold turnip ale drank a cup herself and declared it better than she remembered. The potter wrapped a chipped bowl in cloth and said he might give it to his cousin. The herb seller Agnes packed her rosemary last. She always left it out the longest for the smell. The baker's apprentice returned to sweep the square, dragging a stiff bristled broom over the stones in slow, deliberate strokes. He whistled a tuneless melody as he worked, not quite in key, not quite in time. One by one, the carts rolled away. One by one, the coins were counted. One by one, the last buyers drifted home, and the market emptied itself of sound, of movement, of trade, leaving only stillness and the memory of voices. Even the gossip had gone quiet. No one mentioned the mayor's horse again. No one wondered if the sugar candy would be rosewater or mint. No one asked if the belts would be cheaper next week. The town bell rang once more, low, deep, soft. Not a warning, not a call, just a note floating through the evening like a breath. And somewhere in the quiet square, the reed flute still played. As twilight deepened, a faint gold hue brushed the rooftops above the market square, turning the rough wooden beams of the closed stalls into silhouettes. The town of Wickmere grew quieter still, though it had never been particularly loud to begin with. The sleepy hum of the market had become a gentle hush. Only the faintest sounds lingered. A broom brushing stone, a shutter creaking closed, a soft dog's sigh as it curled into a tighter coil beneath a cart. A soft rain began, not quite enough to send anyone scurrying, just the sort of drizzle that softened the air and made everything smell faintly of earth and old wool. The last of the day's merchants walked slowly, their carts rattling gently behind them. No one hurried, no one needed to. Near the edge of the square, the parchment seller remained, his scrolls now wrapped against the damp. He watched the sky for a while, then spoke to no one in particular about the way clouds always seemed to follow market days. A boy, maybe 12, stood nearby, holding a stick and drawing lines in the damp soil. The seller asked him what he was drawing, and the boy said he didn't know yet. They left it at that. At the old steps where the reed flute man sat, the tune had faded into pauses. Not silence, exactly. Just long, slow breaths between notes. He tapped the flute gently against his knee, his head tilted slightly to one side. The pigeons had returned, as they always did, pecking quietly at invisible crumbs. Down a narrow lane just beyond the stalls, the wool cap seller was closing up for the night. She wrapped each cap in its own cloth square and hummed softly to herself. Her cart was missing one wheel peg, so it tilted slightly to the left as she pushed it, but she didn't complain. She never did. She just pushed it more carefully, letting the cart make its soft, familiar wobble as it moved. A cat leapt from a barrel and padded past, tail high, silent as a whisper. It paused to sniff at a crate of wilted greens, then disappeared behind the fishmonger's shuttered stall. Inside the small bakery just off the square, the apprentice stirred the embers in the hearth, watching the last of the dough brown on the cooling stones. He didn't speak, he rarely did, but he looked at the bread with a kind of quiet pride, and the baker nodded once and gave him the last corner of a honey loaf. He ate it slowly, staring at the dancing light in the fireplace. Meanwhile, Agnes the herb seller walked the long way home, her basket lighter than usual. She stopped to talk to the lamplighter, who had lit 4 posts so far and was taking a break to rest his ankle. He asked if she had anything for aching joints. She pulled out a small pouch of comfrey and gave it to him without charge. In exchange, he promised to light the post by her gate a bit earlier next week. In the square, mist was beginning to settle. It curled between the cobblestones and wrapped around the empty stalls like a blanket. Everything looked a little softer, a little rounder, as though the day were slowly folding in on itself. Even the stones seemed quieter. Matilda, the seller of second-hand tunics, was one of the last to leave. She tugged her cart by the handles, the sleeves of an old smock dragging just slightly behind. She didn't notice. She was thinking about what to make for supper. Maybe lentils, or maybe just bread and turnip mash again. It didn't matter much. Behind her, a man swept the square with a wide broom, tracing long, slow arcs over the damp stones. He didn't sweep fast, he didn't need to. No one was watching, and there was no rush. He liked the sound it made, the soft brushing of straw on stone. He said it helped him think, though he never said what he thought about. And still, the town bell did not chime. It waited. It always waited until the market was truly, completely still. The bell would not rush, and so the market waited with it, waited and settled, waited and softened, waited and faded into quiet. The rain had stopped. It hadn't been much, barely more than a whisper against the rooftops, but now it had faded completely, leaving behind the smell of wet stone and cooled dust. A light fog lingered along the edge of the town square, pooling in the corners where the stalls had stood, wrapping itself around the old well like a shawl. No one used the well much these days. A newer one had been dug closer to the bakery, and most folks preferred the shorter walk. Still, the old well remained, and each market day, someone always left something small at its edge, a wilted flower, a cracked mug, a coin so thin you could almost see through it. No one ever claimed to leave them, no one ever took them away. The objects simply appeared, and over time disappeared again. Tonight a single apple sat beside the well, round, a bit bruised but not yet rotten. It rested quietly, as if waiting for nothing in particular. Down a narrow alley behind the potter's stall, a stable hand sat on an overturned bucket, slowly rubbing a cloth across a muddy boot. He wasn't in a hurry. He never polished both boots at once. He did one in the evening, one the next morning. It gave him something to look forward to, he said, though no one ever asked. A flicker of lamplight spilled across the cobbles near his feet, catching the edge of a loose horseshoe nail. He picked it up, turned it over in his hand, and dropped it in his coat pocket. Might be useful later, or might not. It didn't matter much. Further down the row of closed stalls, Jory the sugar candy man was counting the buttons he'd been given. He did this every week, not to keep track of value, but simply because he liked the way they felt in his hand, Some were wooden, some bone, some with tiny flowers painted on them. One was shaped like a duck. He held it up, squinted at it in the fading light, then chuckled once before placing it in a jar marked Favourites. He had made only 3 sales that day, but he had collected 7 buttons, 1 thimble, and a piece of string that looked exactly like a snail. He considered the day a success. Back at the stall where the pickled beets had been, a pool of vinegar had formed on the stones. No one had cleaned it yet. The smell wasn't strong, just faintly sour, mingled with the earthiness of the nearby herb stall. A lone fly buzzed in circles, then disappeared under a board. A boy walked past, dragging a stick behind him, tracing long, lazy lines in the dirt. He stopped, looked at the puddle, then stepped over it with careful precision, not because he feared the mess, but because he liked pretending the puddle was a moat and he was a knight. He didn't tell anyone. The story was for him alone. In one of the upper windows overlooking the square, a curtain fluttered. An old woman leaned out slowly, her chin resting on her hand. She had watched every market day for years, rarely speaking, never visiting, but she knew everyone by the way they moved. She could tell the potter by his slow, even walk. She could tell the tunic sellers by the way they tilted their heads when listening. She could even recognize the baker's apprentice from the way he always scratched his left ear before sweeping. She didn't wave. She didn't call out. She simply watched until the fog thickened and the figures became too soft to distinguish. Then she closed the window and lit a single candle in a clay dish. Below her, the lamplighter was making his final rounds. The post near the herb seller's gate had already been lit, just as promised. The light shimmered in the damp air, casting uneven shadows on the wall. The lamplighter tapped the metal base gently as he always did, twice. Tap, tap. Not for any real reason, just habit. He turned, adjusted his coat and moved on. By now, most of the square was empty. The carts were gone, the stalls packed away. The gossip had ended. No one whispered about the mayor's horse. No one speculated on the brewer's apprentice. No one asked what next week's prices might be. All those sounds had folded themselves into silence, and the market square sighed in relief. In the final quiet stretch of night, a light mist covered the square like breath on glass. The last of the sweepers passed through, their brooms now more for ritual than purpose. The stones were as clean as they would be. The puddle of vinegar had faded, even the smell of bread had drifted off, replaced by cool night air and the faint trace of ash from nearby hearths. A dog padded across the square, one of the 2 that always napped under the tannery table. This one walked slowly, ears low, tail swinging in lazy arcs. It paused near the old well, sniffed the bruised apple, then lay down beside it, curling into a loose circle. It didn't bark. It didn't sigh. It simply rested, as if it belonged there. And perhaps it did. Somewhere beyond the walls of the town, an owl hooted once, then twice. A soft sound, not sharp. A reminder of night's rhythm, nothing more. In the bakery, the apprentice had finally gone to bed, leaving a faint glow in the oven's coals. The reed flute had fallen silent. The candy seller's buttons were tucked away. The tunics had been folded. The rope seller's coils were stacked. The broom had been propped against the tannery wall. There were no more footsteps, no more voices, no more trades. The market was finished. The day was folded. The stories were put away, and the square waited once more for morning, for bustle, for coins and chatter and gentle drama to return. But not yet, not tonight. Tonight, the square was still. Quiet, software asleep. Some time later, long after the last cart had vanished down the narrow hill road, a faint creak came from the wooden sign above the baker's door. It swung gently in the night breeze, its rusty iron hinge sighing each time it moved. No one heard it but the wind itself, and the wind did not answer. A single mouse scurried across the market square, moving in starts and stops, pausing every few steps as if deciding whether or not to turn back. It didn't. It reached the edge of a crate left behind and disappeared into the shadows beneath it. There was nothing inside the crate but a broken sprig of thyme and a bit of paper stuck to the corner. Neither smelled of food, but the mouse stayed a while anyway. In one darkened window behind a crooked row of flower pots, a candle flickered weakly. The flame danced in place for a moment before settling into a steady, pale glow. The room behind the candle was empty now, but earlier that day someone had sat there shelling peas into a wooden bowl, humming the same tune the reed flute man had played by the steps. Perhaps she would return in the morning, or perhaps not. The candle didn't mind either way. On the far edge of the town, past the old mill path, the sound of a wooden gate bumping in the wind echoed faintly, soft and uneven, like a lullaby with no words. It had been left unlatched by someone in a hurry, though no one in the village was ever truly in a hurry. The gate would keep swinging until morning, tapping gently against the post, reminding no one in particular that it was still there. Back in the square, the fog had thickened just enough to blur the lines between things. The well no longer looked like a well. The barrels were soft shapes now. The brooms, left propped against walls, looked like sleeping figures. Even the dog by the apple had faded slightly into the mist, its form no more distinct than a shadow painted in charcoal. Somewhere, a door clicked shut. A wooden latch dropped into place. A lock turned, not loudly, not firmly, just the soft final sound of a day coming to an end. A sparrow fluttered under the eaves of the cooper's workshop. It shook off droplets from its feathers and settled into a dry spot in the corner, tucking its head under its wing. It wouldn't sing until morning. The square waited, still. No coins clinked. No bartering voices called. No hands gestured toward onions or cloth or pickled eggs. No gossip slipped between neighbours. Not even a whisper of what the blacksmith's niece had said, or whether the belts would be longer next week, or whether the apples from the northern orchard had truly all gone soft. Even the rumours had fallen asleep. In the corner of the square, an overturned bucket caught a bit of water from the earlier rain. It wasn't much, only enough to reflect the shimmer of a lantern above it, the light slightly distorted by the ripples of wind. A moth circled the glow once, then twice, then flew off in no particular direction. The shop shutters were all closed now, latches drawn, curtains pulled. Some of the doors were wedged with stones to keep them from rattling. Others had simply been shut carefully, their handles left to rest in silence. No one moved in or out. No one peeked through cracks. The town had folded into itself, tucking its thoughts beneath heavy quilts and straw-stuffed pillows. And still the old sign creaked, just once every few minutes, just enough to let the night know it was not quite done. The sweepers would return in the morning. The stalls would be dragged back into place. Coins would be counted again. Children would trade feathers for candy again. The baker's apprentice would forget to sweep the corners. Someone would lose a shoe. Someone would argue, gently, about the price of fat. But not now. Now, the market square belonged only to the dark, and the quiet, and the waiting. Now, it breathed like a slow, steady sleeper, rising, falling, rising again. Even the lamplight flickered less often now. Even the fog had gone still. Even time itself seemed to have taken a blanket and curled up in the corner beside the old well. And the story, such as it was, such as it had always been, stretched on in silence. A market without motion, a square without sound, a village wrapped in fog and rest and the soft, forgettable lull of ordinary things. A soft chill crept in from the distant hills, curling around doorframes and slipping beneath shutters. It wasn't cold, just the kind of cool that made blankets feel heavier and stone floors feel damp. The village did not stir. It rarely did at this hour. Even the animals had fallen into that quiet part of the night where no movement seems necessary. A single cartwheel, forgotten against the side of the fishmonger's stall, tipped slightly on its side and rested there. Its spokes were cracked. A small spider had built a web between two of them. The strands caught no prey. There was none to catch, but they glistened faintly in the lantern glow that still hummed beside the tannery wall. That lantern was always the last to burn out. No one knew why. The dog at the well shifted slightly, lifting its head for a moment, then lowering it again. Not because it heard anything, only because some memory of a sound flickered in its sleep. The bruised apple beside it had begun to soften, its skin dimpling just slightly, as if sighing into the night. Near the steps where the reed flute player had sat earlier in the day, the wind had brushed away the last of his footprints. There was no sign now that anyone had been there, except perhaps for a smooth place on the stone where the air still seemed to hum with silence. If you stood very still, you might imagine a note or two echoing there, but there was no sound, only the idea of one. A sliver of moonlight peeked between two low clouds and spilled into the square, stretching itself across the cobbles in a long, narrow stripe. It fell on a row of stacked baskets, each empty, each tilted slightly to one side. The moonlight didn't linger, it faded again as the clouds passed, and the stripe of silver melted into grey once more. Further down the lane, beside the blacksmith's closed shop, a trail of crushed rosemary led from a discarded bundle to the edge of a doorway. The scent was faint but unmistakable, herbal, dry, and oddly comforting. It was likely Agnes's bundle. She had probably dropped it while adjusting her shawl. She never did tie that basket properly. In the bakery, the coals had gone cold. The glow was gone, but the scent of flour and ash still hung in the air, mingling with the smell of old cloth and faint smoke from the nearby chimney. The baker snored softly upstairs. The apprentice stirred once in his cot, scratched his nose and turned over. Neither of them would wake before dawn. Even the mice in the walls had gone still. Even the pigeons had stopped shifting on the roof beams. Even the wind, so restless earlier, had curled up somewhere and decided to wait. Time passed without remark. No clocks ticked in Wickmere. Time there moved by the habits of people, the clink of a coin, the sweep of a broom, the tug of a cartwheel, the hush of a curtain drawn, and now none of those things were happening, so time itself slowed down, yawned once, and sank into the spaces between the stones. Nothing changed, and that was the most comforting part. The market did not need to change. It only needed to rest. A small bag of cracked corn left behind on a bench shifted as something nudged it from underneath. A hedgehog emerged slowly, blinking into the open air. It sniffed once, twice, then turned around and vanished into the shadows. The corn stayed where it was. The shutters of the cap seller's window creaked faintly in the breeze, but no one heard it. The latch had come loose again. She would notice in the morning, or maybe the next day. Either way, it would be fixed eventually, as it always was. A broken stool leaned beside the apothecary's door. No one had sat on it all day, no one had moved it. Still, it remained, a little off balance but not falling. It had been that way for months, maybe longer. Some said it belonged to the apothecary's father, though no one could remember if that was true. And above it all, the sky drifted quietly. No stars twinkled too brightly. No clouds hurried past. Even the moon seemed in no rush, hanging low and dull and calm. Not far from the centre of the square, where the old road curved slightly before meeting the carpenter's alley, a small feather rested on the ground. It had not been dropped in any hurry. It seemed to have settled gently, perhaps from a passing sparrow, or perhaps from nowhere at all. It barely moved when the breeze passed, and when it did, it only shivered, as if uncertain whether to stay or float away. In the narrow space between two shuttered shops, a crooked clothesline hung slack. It hadn't held anything in days, and one end had lost its peg. The remaining cord swayed lazily back and forth, rhythmically brushing the wood of the wall. Tap, pause, tap, pause. A sound no one could hear, but that echoed anyway in the quiet of the square. Above the ink seller's window, the faded sign still creaked gently. A corner of it was chipped, and one of the painted letters had flaked away. It used to say, "Paper and Inkwell," but now it simply said, "Per and Ink." No one bothered to repaint it. Everyone knew what it meant. Behind the tunic stool, now long since packed away, someone had forgotten a stool. It was a small three-legged thing with one slightly shorter leg. It wobbled gently when the wind pressed against it, and for a long moment it seemed it might tip over. But it didn't. It simply stayed upright, perfectly unimportant, perfectly content to be unnoticed. Near the well, the dog had shifted again, not because of noise, or cold, or hunger, but just to stretch. Its back legs extended, then curled back beneath its body. A soft yawn escaped, almost inaudible. The bruised apple beside it had begun to weep a little juice onto the stone. A beetle, slow and polite, passed it by without stopping. The lantern near the tannery had finally guttered out. The flame didn't sputter. It just grew smaller and smaller until it wasn't there at all. No one saw it. No one would notice until the next evening, when the lamplighter would come with his pole and his bundle of cloth and relight it without comment. From one of the chimney stacks, a single puff of smoke curled up into the night, then vanished. It might have been from a late tea, or a hearth being banked for the night. No one knew. No one wondered. It was simply part of the night, like the soft wind, the damp stones, the feather, the empty carts, and the hush that hung like fog over everything. At the far edge of town, near the small wooden bridge that led to the mill path, a soft trickle of water could be heard. It had always been there, though few ever noticed it. Just a stream, slow and steady, passing under the bridge and weaving its way between reeds and stones. A frog croaked once, then fell silent again. Nothing stirred the surface of the water. The shops that lined the square, shoemaker, potter, seamstress, baker, were now indistinguishable in the dark, their signs no longer readable, their windows dark, their doorsteps swept clean by time and breeze and absence. They no longer looked like shops, just shapes, just parts of the square, sleeping like everything else. Somewhere inside the seamstress's cottage, a spindle rested beside a patch of cloth. The thread still ran from one to the other, as though caught mid-thought. The woman who had left it there had gone to bed hours ago and would not remember whether she had finished her row. It didn't matter. The cloth waited patiently, and time passed again, not loudly, not in great leaps, just slowly, softly, evenly. The village did not count the moments, it only felt them pass like a breath in and a breath out. Along the northern wall of the square, where ivy had begun to crawl over the stones, a wooden bench sat tucked beneath an overhang. It was always there, though rarely used. In summer, it got too much sun. In winter, it was often damp, but on nights like this, cool, damp, and still, it simply existed, unbothered by purpose. A scrap of parchment fluttered beneath it, caught in a shallow groove between two cobblestones. The ink had long since faded, and the writing was impossible to read, but someone, at some point, had written something on it, perhaps a list of herbs, or a half-finished poem, or a note meant to be passed discreetly. Now it was only a page with soft edges and no intention. A short distance away, beside the shuttered candle stall, the scent of beeswax lingered faintly in the air. It had been hours since the stall closed, but the smell clung to the boards and the rope and the ground itself. A cat padded past, paused, sniffed once, then continued walking, tail upright and silent. The cat, grey and slightly ragged around the ears, was known to a few of the merchants. No one claimed it, but everyone seemed to know its habits. It visited the herb seller when she was sorting mint, the baker when the crusts were being trimmed, and the tunic sisters when buttons were being sewn. Now it had nowhere to visit and nothing to watch, so it walked without hurry, vanishing slowly into the side alley behind the cooper's shed. Above the market square, clouds drifted lazily, pale against the darker sky. The moon had tucked itself behind one of them now, casting everything in a soft, grey blur. The fog, still resting gently on the ground, made lantern posts look taller, as though they stretched into the sky. Not far from the centre of the square, the old chalkboard used for listing prices leaned against a barrel. Someone had forgotten to wipe it clean. In the dim moonlight, the faint traces of numbers and items could still be seen. Turnips, 2 for 1. Candles, 3 copper or 1 fig. Eggs, 1 egg equals 1 button. The handwriting was uneven. Someone had written over the corner with a drawing of a face, possibly a duck, though it could have been a goose. The chalk had smudged slightly from the mist, but the board remained half forgotten and completely unimportant. Nothing needed changing, nothing needed saying. The board would be wiped tomorrow, or the next day, or never. It would fade just like everything else. Inside the apothecary's home, the fire had gone out entirely. The ash glowed faintly in the hearth, but gave off no more heat. On the table near the window, a row of glass bottles caught the moonlight. Most were empty. A few held bits of dried leaf or seeds, labelled in tiny script. The labels curled at the edges. One bottle had a cork that no longer fit, but it remained anyway, kept more for comfort than function. A thin layer of dust had begun to settle across the windowsill. No one would notice it tomorrow. No one would clean it. It would simply stay until brushed away by accident, perhaps by a sleeve or a passing elbow, or not at all. Back outside, the cobblestones had cooled completely. Even the puddles left by the early evening rain had gone still. No ripples, no movement, just dark pools reflecting the soft outline of rooftops and the vague shimmer of sky. Somewhere near the edge of the square, a barn owl passed silently overhead. Its wings made no sound, and its shadow was only visible for a moment as it glided across the rooftops and disappeared into the fields. It was not hunting, it was simply flying because the sky was there. The square remained unchanged, still, slower than time, quieter than memory, wrapped in the gentle hush of everything left undone, unbought, unsaid. And all of it exactly as it should be. Near the far corner of the square, where a patch of moss had crept between the stones over many years, a single wooden spoon lay abandoned. It was slightly curved, its handle worn smooth by use. Perhaps it had slipped from a pocket or fallen from a cart, or perhaps someone had meant to leave it, an offering or a quiet farewell. No one saw it fall. No one came back to retrieve it. And the spoon lay there still, catching a glint of moonlight whenever the clouds shifted just enough. Not far from the spoon, a soft rustling came from a sack that had been left half-filled beneath an awning. Inside were sprigs of dry barley, their stalks bent and curled from the day's breeze. A few beetles had found their way into the sack, moving slowly and deliberately among the grains. They didn't rush, they had all night. Above the awning, a shutter banged gently against its frame, tapping now and then in the rhythm of the wind. The sound was not sharp. It was soft, wood on wood, worn at the edges, too weathered to be startling. Just one more layer of nighttime sound that no one heard and no one needed to. Further down the row of buildings, a ladder leaned forgotten against the candle seller's wall. It had been used earlier that morning to adjust the canopy ropes, but no one had thought to bring it in. Now it stood there, quiet and useless, waiting without urgency for the return of daylight. A small puddle beneath the ladder reflected the lantern pole across the square, upside down and flickering as though the pole had been dropped into another world. A moth hovered over the water, turned once in a slow spiral, then vanished into the dark. Behind the bakery, the old millstone rested beside a pile of flour sacks. It was no longer used for grinding, only for leaning tools or sitting down during breaks. Someone had left a half-eaten biscuit on its edge, a little dry, slightly burnt, and now home to a single curious ant. The ant moved in loops, circling the crumb, then leaving it alone. The town of Wickmere did not shine at night. It did not sparkle or glow or sing. It simply rested. And that was enough. The rooftops, their thatch damp with mist, seemed to lean together gently, like tired heads nodding off. Chimneys stood like silent sentries, watching over windows that no longer lit the square. The rain barrels, tucked beneath eaves and corners, caught the drip of condensation, one drop at a time. Plink, plink, and then silence again. A patch of garden behind the tunic stall lay quiet, its rows of turnips and onions barely visible in the fog. A scarecrow leaned in the middle, tilted slightly to one side, missing one arm. Its straw stuffing poked out from a tear in its side, and a small blue ribbon was tied around its neck. No one remembered who had put the ribbon there. It had faded to almost grey. The ground was soft there. The air was cool. The quiet was unbroken. Even the wind, which had passed through so often during the day, now wandered elsewhere. Perhaps into the woods, perhaps into the hills. Here, in the square, it left only stillness. Time passed again, though no one kept track. There were no clocks in the market square. No bells rang after nightfall. No shadows moved with urgency. And so the town dreamed, even while awake. Dreamed of trading days and simple bargains, of chipped mugs and fragrant herbs, of forgotten buttons and tunics folded thrice. Dreamed of nothing more than what had been, and nothing less. At the edge of the square, not far from where the hedge grew thick and unruly beside the cooper's fence, a lantern hook stood empty. It had once held a signal light for travellers returning from the fields after dark, but no one had used it in years. Still, the hook remained, curved and rusted, always there. Sometimes it swayed when the breeze passed just right, though it held nothing. Beneath it, a patch of earth had turned to soft mud from the earlier drizzle. A single boot print rested in the centre, likely the baker's apprentice, who often cut through the hedge when carrying flour sacks. The print was shallow, half-faded. It would be gone by morning. The earth would remember it longer than the people would. Along the row of shuttered homes, roof tiles occasionally clicked against one another, barely audible, just faint taps as the cooling air shifted their weight. Somewhere behind the potter's stall, a bucket tipped over with a muted thud. No one stirred. The sound was too soft to wake even a restless cat. Inside the clothier's cottage, where the tunics were sewn and re-sewn with stubborn thread, a candle had been left burning low, its flame now no taller than a pin, wavering gently in the draught under the door. It would gutter out soon, leaving behind a thin trail of smoke that curled toward the ceiling and vanished before it touched the rafters. Near the steps where the reed flute once played, the air was unusually still. The stone had cooled, the dust had settled, and the space where the old man had sat no longer looked like a place for anyone. It had simply returned to being a step, grey, quiet, and part of the square. And still, no one passed through. No carts creaked, no voices murmured, no doors opened or closed. The square had become something else entirely now. Not just a place without people, but a place without time. It had become a memory too tired to be remembered. Inside the small granary near the back lane, sacks of oats rested against each other like sleepers huddled in a shared bed. Some leaned a bit more than others. One had torn slightly along the top seam, and a few grains had spilled into the corner. A mouse had found them but eaten only a few. It had left the rest untouched, as though full or simply distracted by the stillness. A wooden scoop lay beside the sacks. It had been carved long ago, its surface polished by use. The initials HT were etched faintly into the handle. No one remembered who HT was. The scoop remained, perfectly content to be forgotten. Back in the square, the chalkboard with the half-faded prices had fallen over in the breeze. It hadn't made a sound. It simply lay flat now, the drawing of the duck or goose no longer visible. In the fog, it looked like nothing more than a slab of wood, blending into the stones beneath it. The cracked pot beside the herb stall was gathering dew. A single leaf had fallen into it from the tree above, floating quietly on the surface. It spun a little when the air moved, then stopped. A child's doll, missing one arm and most of its stuffing, sat against the post of the shuttered sweet shop. Its dress was torn, and one eye had been sewn back on with mismatched thread. No one had claimed it. It had been there for days, maybe longer. It was not eerie, just tired, the way toys often are at the end of a long play. Somewhere, deeper inside one of the cottages, someone turned over in sleep, sighed, and pulled the covers closer. But outside, the square made no notice of it. Everything outside had gone quiet. More than quiet. Still as bread rising in the warmth. Still as wool waiting to be spun. Still as a story that no longer needed to be told. Near the tannery's back wall, where scraps of leather were once hung out to dry, a line of hooks stood empty. The straps were all packed away now, the buckets scrubbed clean and tucked under the bench. Still, the smell lingered. Old leather, faint lye, and something deeper, like rain on stone. The smell was part of the air now, and no one minded. It reminded the town that things had once happened there. A pair of sandals, too small for most adults, rested beneath the bench. The straps were frayed, the soles worn thin. Someone had likely changed into boots and forgotten them, or perhaps they had simply outgrown them and left them behind without ceremony. Either way they sat side by side, quiet, waiting for nothing. At the edge of the cobbled square, weeds had begun pushing through the cracks again. Each spring they were tugged out, and each autumn they returned. Now, in the cool night air, they swayed gently, just enough to say, "We are still here." One had tiny white flowers, barely wider than a grain of rice. No one would notice them. No one needed to. Further along, beside the old forge, a barrel had been overturned and used as a seat. A ring from a mug still marked the top, stained faintly into the wood. The mug was gone now, collected or kicked aside. But the ring stayed, like a quiet reminder of a conversation once had, now long forgotten. Inside the forge itself, the hearth was dark. The bellows, stitched with care decades ago, slumped forward like a sleeping hound. The iron tools on the wall had cooled completely and didn't shine anymore, not without the firelight. But they hung in place, exactly as the blacksmith had left them. Hooks, hammers, tongs, chisels, all lined up like thoughts waiting to be remembered. Outside, the fog had thickened again. The lantern poles had faded into the grey. The outlines of doorways blurred. The shapes of windows softened. Only the familiar squeak of the sign above the bakery remained, once every few minutes, slow and steady. Just one sound, keeping time with nothing. In the patch of garden behind the seamstress's house, the dew had begun to gather on the cabbage leaves. The rows were slightly crooked, but no one minded. She grew them more for comfort than need. A small spade leaned against a fence post, its handle wrapped in twine. The twine had once been red, but now looked more like earth. A clay bowl rested nearby, filled with stones. Flat, smooth stones, each one labelled in charcoal, initials, shapes, faint pictures. Children from the village had drawn on them one afternoon and left them there. The drawings had started to smudge, but still the bowl remained, half full, never moved. A crow had landed once beside the bowl earlier that evening. It had poked at the stones, knocked one over, then flown off. It hadn't returned. Back in the square, the bench beneath the ivy wall had gathered a pool of water. A single leaf floated on top, round-edged, dull brown, completely still. It hadn't rained in hours, but the leaf moved slightly anyway, nudged by the slow breath of the night. Inside the old bookshop, where the scrolls and ink were kept, a book had fallen from a shelf. No one had noticed. No one would. It landed face down on the floor, half open to a chapter about medicinal herbs and garden lore. The page had curled. The ink had faded. It made no difference. The book would stay there until someone thought to pick it up again. That might be days. It might be longer. The book did not care. The square breathed again, not heavily, just softly, a breath in, a breath out. The story paused, not because it ended, but because there was nothing left to say, for now. And still the fog held steady, still the cobblestones cooled, still the quiet deepened until the silence itself had texture, like wool, like smoke, like sleep. Beneath a crooked gutter at the side of the fish stall, a small puddle had begun to dry. It was shallow now, barely more than a damp patch in the stone, but it still carried the faint scent of salt and scales and brine, the kind of smell that clung to the market long after the fish were gone. No one noticed it anymore. It had become part of the square's breath, unremarkable and gently enduring. Just beside the puddle, tucked into the narrowest space between two crates, a crumpled bit of linen lay forgotten. It was the corner of a smock, perhaps torn from someone's sleeve during the bustle of barter. Or perhaps it had been tucked there for safekeeping and then overlooked. It fluttered just slightly when the wind came in slow waves, then lay flat again, tired of waiting to be claimed. Near the baker's doorway, a row of stone steps led down to the cellar. The door was closed now, and a sprig of rosemary, flattened and bent, rested on the top step. Someone had dropped it, or left it as a habit. Agnes, perhaps, when passing by. She often walked with her hands full and her thoughts elsewhere. The herb's scent lingered faintly in the cracks of the stone. Inside the cellar, jars of dried fruit lined the shelf. Pears, mostly, and prunes. One jar was missing its label, and another was sealed with wax that had cracked just slightly across the top. No one would check them until the weekend. Until then, they simply waited, preserved again by silence. Further along the alleyway, a wheelbarrow leaned on its side, one wheel resting in a groove in the earth that had formed from repetition. The handles were stained dark from years of use. The bed of the cart held only a small pile of leaves, blown in by accident and not yet swept out. They were dry. They rustled faintly when the breeze brushed past. On the west side of the square, the fence around the barley shed had begun to lean inward, bowed from age and soft ground. It hadn't fallen, though. It simply tilted, gently, respectfully, as though nodding toward the grain sacks inside. The sacks had been stacked earlier, each one slouched like a sleeping figure. One had a hole near the bottom, just wide enough for a few kernels to escape. A bird might find them in the morning, or perhaps not. No one was watching. Above the shed, a narrow rope had been strung between two windows. It was meant for drying cloth, though tonight it held only one item. A single wool sock, stretched long and slightly faded. It turned slowly in the breeze like a pendulum that had forgotten its task, each turn slower than the one before. Eventually, it would stop. Beneath the sock, a small metal cup rested upside down on the ground. It had once held cider. A ring of sticky residue circled its base, and a bee had found it earlier in the day. But now there were no bees, no sound. The cup reflected a bit of starlight, dull and flickering. Not far from the cup, near the steps that led to the town hall, someone had chalked a hopscotch grid onto the stone. The lines were faint now, blurred by countless feet and a bit of rain. The numbers had faded and one square had worn away entirely. Still, if you looked closely, you could see it, the memory of a game played long ago, laughter now vanished into stone. The last lantern flickered, then flickered again, then stilled. The flame held, and the square settled even deeper into itself. Beneath the overhang of the empty spice stall, a cracked wooden bowl lay turned upside down. The curve of it had gathered dust from the wind and a few stray grains, coriander, perhaps, or crushed fennel. Once that bowl had held bright colours, pungent smells, busy hands stirring and measuring. Now it held only silence. The wind passed over it like breath over parchment, light, forgettable. A small scrap of paper was pinned to the stall's post with a rusted nail. The ink had run from last week's mist, but one could still make out 2 words. Next Tuesday. There was no explanation, no signature. Near the edge of the path where the basket weaver once sold his wares, a single reed lay curled on the stone, bleached pale by the sun and now damp from the fog. It had not been woven into anything. It had been dropped, or spared, or simply overlooked. Its curl was gentle, like a sleeping cat's tail, and it stayed there, unmoved, a little thread of nothing. A short distance away, a row of pebbles lined the edge of the stall's footprint, spaced evenly, as if someone had placed them with care. But they had always been there. No one remembered placing them, and no one disturbed them. They marked nothing, pointed to nothing. They simply remained, quiet little ovals and smooth-edged triangles, grey and beige and one pale blue. The night air had turned cooler now, not sharply, but enough that the fog settled thicker across the square. It did not roll or swirl. It simply hung, like a wool blanket draped over everything. The tops of the barrels disappeared first, then the lantern posts, then the shutters above the shops. What was left became quieter still. In a corner where 2 cottages leaned toward each other, close enough that their rooftops almost kissed, a string had been tied from one window to the other. Small cloth flags once hung there, stitched by someone long gone. Now only one flag remained, its edge unravelling into threads. It swayed just once every few minutes. That was enough. Beneath the string, a cracked clay jug had been set beside the door. Inside was only rainwater and one tiny snail clinging to the rim. The snail didn't move. Not tonight, perhaps not tomorrow either. But it had found the jug, and that was enough. Down a narrow lane behind the baker's cottage, a little bench rested against the wall. Its surface was uneven from years of sitting, and the leg closest to the gutter had sunk slightly into the earth. Someone had once carved their name into the bench, but it had faded so thoroughly that the name could now belong to anyone, or to no one at all. A tea tin with no lid sat on the bench, empty, rusting at the edges. Inside were a few dry pine needles and a single seed pod, split open, the kind of thing a child might collect, or the kind of thing someone might place there and forget. Either way, no one claimed it, and so it sat, gathering dew. A moth landed on the tin for a moment, folding its wings tightly against its back. Then it left again, not in any hurry. Further up the lane, a woolen scarf had been hung over a fence post. The ends dangled, brushing the wooden rails. The pattern was barely visible now, once a checkered red and brown, now mostly grey. One end had unravelled. The thread trailed downward like a strand of spider silk. It caught the mist and glistened faintly. No one would come looking for it tonight. In a window nearby, the faint shape of a candle could be seen, unlit, tucked in the corner of the sill behind a glass bottle. The candle had never been used. Its wick was clean, but it stood upright, as if waiting for a moment that never came, and outside the fog grew thicker still. It didn't blanket the town, it became the town. Near the well, which now looked less like a well and more like a shadow in the fog, the stone ledge had gathered droplets. Not rain, not dew, just condensation from the slow, heavy night. One droplet had collected at the edge of the moss, growing fatter, rounder, until at last it slipped free and fell. It made no sound. There was no splash. Just a moment passing, then gone. The dog had shifted again, this time curling its tail tighter under its chin. Its fur had darkened with moisture, but it did not stir. The apple beside it had collapsed inward, sagging at the stem. Its skin wrinkled like linen left too long on the line. Next to the old notice board, where the goat announcement still hung in blurred defiance, a wooden crate had been turned on its side and used as a resting place by someone earlier that day. The person had left behind a heel of bread, barely a mouthful, hardened now by air and silence. A mouse had found it, nibbled twice, then gone. The bread remained, just a shape now. Not food, not offering, just there. Further down the lane, a gate creaked softly, just once, then held still. A breeze had passed through the square, brief and uncertain. It had moved nothing else. It had made no change, but it had tapped that gate, and the gate had replied. The sound echoed for less than a second and was swallowed whole by the fog. Inside the lamplighter's cottage, a bundle of cloth hung by the hearth. It had once been a coat, now restitched and worn into the shape of its owner. The sleeves drooped like arms too tired to lift. A single button near the collar gleamed, brass older than the rest, kept for luck. The lamplighter had gone to bed hours ago. He had not checked if all the lanterns were out. He would check tomorrow, or not. At the base of the steps leading to the town hall storeroom, a pile of dried twigs had gathered. No one had swept them. They had simply drifted there, slowly, from the alley, from the tree, from time. One twig had broken in half, its insides pale and splintered. Another still had a curled brown leaf clinging to it, stubborn in the windless air. A wooden ladle leaned against the storeroom door. It had once stirred soup, or dye, or oats. It had not been used today, or yesterday. But someone had placed it there, upright, balanced gently in the groove between door and stone. It hadn't fallen. It might never fall. It had found its place, and that was enough. The fog now reached waist height, then chest, then higher. It covered the square like an old quilt passed from hand to hand, patched, soft, and heavy with rest. In a shed near the orchard, where baskets were stored during the off-days, a pile of rope lay in slow unravelling. Some pieces coiled neatly, others twisted like sleeping snakes. One length had been dyed green, though only a few strands of colour remained. It smelled faintly of mint, or mildew, or both. No one would come to sort it tonight. The rope was fine just as it was. Above the shed, a line of wooden slats let in bits of moonlight through the fog. One slat was cracked, letting in more than the others. A spider had built its web near that slat, angled toward the opening. The web held no insects, only light and mist. It bowed gently, then stilled again, the spider waiting without expectation. A rusted nail stuck out from the shed door. Tied to it was a bit of string. No one could remember what the string had been for. It had no knot, no sign of use, just a little hanging tail, swaying in its own time, and above the clouds thickened and the moon dimmed, and still the square remained, unmoved, unfolded, undisturbed, just past the row of shuttered shops where the cobblestones gave way to flattened earth. A long-forgotten cartwheel leaned against the side of a shed. The rim had split in two places. The spokes had gone soft, but it hadn't fallen. It simply leaned, year after year, catching the quiet like a basin left out for rain. A tuft of grass had grown around its base, thin blades pushing up between gravel and rot. They bent easily in the breeze if there was one, but tonight there was none. Even the air had grown tired of moving. Near the entrance to the alley behind the apothecary's shop, a slat of wood had come loose from the wall. It hung at a slight angle, creaking just once when the fog thickened. The creak was soft, unsure of itself, like a breath taken halfway through sleep. Below it, a row of bricks had darkened with moisture. One had cracked, and in the crack, a tiny snail shell lay nestled like a pearl inside a broken chest. No snail inside. just the shell, just the idea of what had once been there. Further down the alley, a set of garden tools leaned in a crooked bundle, hoe, rake, broom, all held together by their own weight. The rake's wooden handle had split at the top, and someone had wrapped it tightly with string. The string had held, but only just. Still, no one fixed it. It worked well enough. Behind the bundle, a door stood ajar, not wide, just enough to suggest it hadn't latched properly. No one came to shut it. No light came from inside. Only the faintest smell of soil, of burlap, of stones that had been moved and put back again. In the window of the seamstress's cottage, a pair of wooden buttons sat on the sill, matching, round and warm with years of touch. She had meant to sew them to a waistcoat, or maybe a scarf, but the fabric had run out, or perhaps she'd forgotten. They had sat there ever since, gathering threads of dust and morning light. One of them had tipped slightly, its edge resting just against the base of the window frame. From the street, they looked like eyes watching nothing. Across from the cottage, a watering can lay on its side in the grass. A few beads of water clung to its spout. They didn't fall. They simply held there, caught between motion and stillness, unsure of their next step, like everything in Wickmere after dark. A crumpled cloth sat beside the can, faded from years of sun. It had once been green, or maybe grey, or maybe both. The hem had frayed and curled, making the edges look like petals from a flower that had never opened. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, not loudly, just one slow note, long and low, like a memory slipping out the back door, then nothing. The sound did not echo. It did not stir the cat beneath the bench. It did not turn the head of the sleeping dog by the well. It simply passed, unnoticed. And still the night held its breath. The doorways stayed closed. The shutters stayed still. The moss continued growing across the same old cornerstone, slowly reclaiming what time had left behind. Even the dust in the corners had stilled now, no more drifting, no more settling, just resting, as though the world had already gone to sleep and everything else was waiting for it to finish dreaming. By the edge of the path that curved behind the baker's cottage, a line of footprints had begun to vanish into the damp. They weren't deep, just soft impressions in earth packed by countless quiet days, too faint to track, too old to follow. Only the curve of the heel and the round of a toe remained, blurring into the ground like shadows melting into dusk. Near the final print, a strand of thread fluttered against a bush, pale blue, thin, barely visible. It was caught on a leaf, brushing the air every time the leaf moved, and the leaf only moved when the mist thickened, which it did, slowly, without urgency. A wooden bench sat nearby, tucked against the bakery wall beneath the small window where the apprentice once rested trays of rolls to cool. The bench was damp now, its seat bowed with age. One of its legs had sunken slightly into the soft soil below, and the whole thing leaned just a little, like it was tired too, but still trying to sit upright. On the windowsill above it, 3 crumbs remained, left behind from a late snack, or perhaps from nothing at all. A small black ant circled the largest crumb, tapped it with its legs, then walked away. The crumb did not mind, it was used to being left alone. Further on, in the corner of a courtyard where 2 stone buildings met at a narrow angle, a lantern hook still stood, though it held no lantern. Rust had crept along its edge, and the curve had bent slightly, like an old arm reaching toward nothing. Beneath it, a pile of damp leaves had gathered, brown, soft, pressed flat by time. One leaf curled at the tip, as if still trying to hold a bit of its former self. The rest had given up trying. In the middle of those leaves, the corner of a book cover peeked through, leather softened and cracked, its spine torn loose. Perhaps a ledger, perhaps a prayer book. Perhaps just a bit of cardboard and string. No one would open it tonight. No one needed to. It belonged to the quiet now. A stone drain nearby released one last droplet of water with a soft tick, then another, then nothing. The square had dried, and the pipes had emptied. The droplet marks vanished into the soil almost instantly, like tiny secrets taken back by the earth. In the storeroom beside the candle seller's home, a row of wax scraps rested in a crate, short stubs that would never be sold, the leftovers of brighter evenings and warmer hands. One of the stubs still had a bit of wick left, and if someone were to light it, it would burn for maybe 5 minutes, no more. But no one would light it now, and the wick did not ask to be used. Next to the crate, a folded length of linen lay draped over a barrel, creased from having been tied once, untied later, then never folded again. The edges had curled. The middle was marked by the soft shadow of an old oil stain, barely visible in the night. A beetle climbed its way slowly along the fold, paused, then turned back the way it came. The storeroom smelled faintly of smoke, wax, and memory. Outside, the fog thickened again, until even the barrels began to blur at the edges, until even the window frames seemed to bend inward, until even sound gave up on existing for a while, and the square forgot it was a square, and the buildings forgot they were buildings, and the village forgot it was awake, and everything stayed, and so the market square of Wickmere lies still. The stalls are long packed away, the shutters drawn, the candles out, no coins, no chatter, no hurried footsteps on stone, just silence and fog and the slow, resting breath of a village that has nothing left to do. All the crumbs have settled, all the chairs have cooled, even the smallest corners have stopped remembering what they were waiting for. There is no more story to tell, and there doesn't need to be. The night has covered everything, and everything has welcomed it. So now, let your thoughts drift gently, like the string on the lantern hook, like the feather in the hay, like the last bit of chalk dust left on the board. There's nowhere to go, nothing to fix and nothing to finish. Only this long, quiet moment, this breath, this hush. Stay here a while, let the square hold you, let the stillness settle over your shoulders, and sleep, sleep, sleep.